For Ang Zhang-du, the day of the royal wedding was a day for revenge. He travelled to Northampton armed with a knife and murdered a family of 4.
Have you ever looked at a happy family photo and wondered what secrets might be hidden behind those smiling faces? Sometimes the most devastating stories come from the people who seem to have it all together, the ones no one ever suspects. Today's story is one of those, a tragedy so brutal, so shocking, that even hardened investigators were left speechless. And what makes it even more disturbing, the victims weren't strangers to the killer, they were his own family. This is not just another crime story. This is about betrayal, obsession, and a horrifying descent into darkness. The Ding Family Massacre in Northampton, England, was more than a murder. It was a calculated act of vengeance, soaked in blood and heartbreak, and it shook an entire community to its core. So if you've got a moment, stay with me, because in this video, we're going to walk through the final hours of the Ding family, the chilling mind of the man who ended their lives, and how the authorities unraveled the nightmare. What you're about to hear will challenge everything. You thought you knew about love, loyalty, and how far one man was willing to go for revenge. Let's start with who the Dings were. You might not recognize their names, but Ang Xiang and Ge Chui Ding were respected members of their local community in Northampton, kind, hard-working, and raising 2 bright daughters, Xing and Alice. The Ding family was everything you'd hope a family could be. Ang Xiang ran a Chinese herbal medicine business. Ji was a well-regarded teacher. Together, they had built a quiet, successful life in the UK after immigrating from China, working tirelessly to provide a good future for their girls. But there was another man lurking in the shadows of their lives, Ang Xiang-du. To understand what happened on that spring day in 2011, we need to talk about him. Ang Xiang-du was not a stranger. He used to be a business partner of the Dings. In fact, years earlier, they had all gone into business together, investing time and money into a Chinese herbal remedy shop. But things didn't go smoothly. Eventually, tensions rose, trust was broken, and lawsuits began. The Dings had taken Du to court, and they won. But while they moved on, Du couldn't let it go. For nearly a decade, he harbored resentment. He lost his money, his business reputation, and he believed the Dings were to blame for it all. And like a pot left to boil over, that bitterness didn't just simmer, it exploded. April 29th, 2011. While millions across the UK were glued to their TVs watching the royal wedding of Prince William and Kate Middleton, something horrific was brewing in a quiet cul-de-sac in Northampton. Du, fueled by rage and revenge, got into his car and made the drive to the Dings' home. Now imagine this. It's a peaceful Friday afternoon. The sun is out, neighbours are relaxed. Some are even hanging out flags to celebrate the royal festivities. And behind one door, a man is preparing to destroy an entire family. Du arrived at the Dings' house, carrying a knife. Not just any knife, but one he had taken from his own home, which tells us this wasn't a spontaneous attack. This was premeditated, cold, ruthless. Inside the home were all 4 family members. Ang Xiang, Ge, and their 2 daughters, both teenagers. What happened next is almost too horrific to describe, but it must be told. Du entered their home and one by one slaughtered every member of the Ding family. He stabbed Ang Xiang and Ge first, then he turned to the girls, Xing just 18 and Alice 12. He didn't show mercy. He didn't stop to consider the children's lives or their futures. It was a massacre. Pure and simple. And then, he calmly walked out. Du didn't run. He didn't panic. He didn't turn himself in. Instead, he took the family's car, dumped it, and went on the run. For over a year, the killer of the Ding family vanished into thin air, sparking one of the most intense international manhunts in British history. And as investigators began piecing the crime together, they were faced with one of the most chilling and calculated killers they'd ever encountered. Now that we've uncovered the beginning of this unimaginable tragedy, the seemingly perfect family, the simmering resentment and the brutal act of violence that changed everything, we're just beginning to scratch the surface. Now that we've seen how Ang Siang-doo turned a long-standing grudge into an act of horrifying violence, let's talk about what happened next, because what followed wasn't just a manhunt. It was a case that exposed just how far someone can go to escape justice, and how heartbreakingly long it can take to get answers. After the murders, Do didn't just vanish. He meticulously covered his tracks. He ditched the stolen car in London and made his way south. Authorities believe that he used buses, cash and fake identities to slip past security measures. While the police were scrambling to piece together a motive, Do was already plotting his escape overseas. For days, investigators combed through evidence at the crime scene. It was clear that the attack had been targeted. Nothing was stolen. There was no sign of forced entry. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was deeply personal. And with the family wiped out, there was no one left to give them answers. Except the man who had disappeared. But Do had made a mistake. Several, in fact. CCTV footage began surfacing. Witnesses reported seeing a man who matched his description leaving the area. And when police traced the family's missing vehicle, they found it abandoned near a coach station. Inside was a map marked with a possible escape route. It led all the way to London, where Do had bought a one-way bus ticket. Still, for months he stayed one step ahead. By the time police realized where he might have gone, it was too late. Do had managed to flee the country. He crossed the English Channel and ended up in Paris. But he didn't stop there. He kept moving, eventually landing in Morocco, a place he believed could shield him from extradition. For over a year, British authorities worked closely with Interpol and Moroccan officials to track him down. It wasn't easy. Morocco had no formal extradition treaty with the UK, and Do was doing everything he could to blend in, living in cheap hostels, doing odd jobs, even pretending to be mute to avoid detection. But justice, no matter how long it takes, has a way of catching up. In July 2012, Moroccan authorities finally caught him. Thin, tired and desperate, Do was arrested in the city of Tangier. When they brought him in, he didn't resist. Maybe deep down, he knew the game was up. But getting him back to the UK wasn't immediate. The extradition process dragged on for nearly a year due to legal complications. All the while, the Ding family's remaining relatives waited, heartbroken, angry, and clinging to hope that one day they would see justice done. Finally, in February 2013, Ang Siang-doo was extradited to the UK. He was charged with 4 counts of murder and held in custody, awaiting trial. For many, his return marked the beginning of closure, but it was also a painful reminder of what had been lost. When the trial began, the evidence against Do was overwhelming. Forensic reports matched his DNA to the scene. CCTV footage placed him near the home. The knife he used was traced back to his own kitchen, and his disappearance, his calculated escape, spoke volumes about his intent. Do's defense. He claimed he had lost control, that he hadn't planned to kill anyone, that the rage took over, but the prosecution wasn't buying it, and neither was the jury. They saw through the excuses, the fake apologies, the calculated lies. He had carried that knife into their home. He had stabbed each member multiple times. He had fled with a plan. This wasn't an accident. It was an execution. In November 2013, Ang Siang-doo was found guilty on all 4 counts of murder. The judge didn't hold back. He called it a revenge attack of unimaginable savagery. Do was sentenced to life in prison, with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 40 years. It was one of the longest sentences handed down in a British court that year. But here's the thing, that no sentence, no matter how harsh, can undo what was done. The Ding family, two loving parents, two promising young girls, were gone. And for what? A business dispute, a bruised ego, a man who let bitterness consume him until it turned into something monstrous. What makes this case especially heartbreaking is how avoidable it all was. Du had years to move on, years to rebuild, but instead he clung to the past like a badge of honor, turning himself into a victim in his own mind. And when people do that, when they refuse to let go of hate, it doesn't just hurt them. It destroys everything around them. There's a lesson in this story. Maybe it's about forgiveness, or maybe it's about the danger of holding on to resentment, because when we don't deal with our pain, when we let it fester, it doesn't just go away. It grows, and sometimes it becomes something we can't control. Let's go deeper into what kind of person Xiang-du really was, and how a man like that can walk among us, unnoticed, until it's too late. We often wonder how someone capable of such horror could hide in plain sight. And that's exactly what Xiang-du did. On the outside, he appeared soft-spoken, polite, even intelligent, the kind of man you might casually greet in a shop or pass on the street without a second thought. But under that calm surface was a storm brewing, one powered by pride, humiliation, and a twisted sense of justice. He wasn't someone living on the edge of society. He wasn't uneducated or desperate. In fact, he was a former university student with a background in science. He was married. He ran a traditional Chinese medicine shop. In many ways, he had everything to live for. But his identity, his pride, it was deeply tied to his image of success. So when the Dings took legal action against him, he didn't just lose a business. He felt like he lost himself. The lawsuits between Du and the Ding family stretched for years. He was ordered to pay large sums of money, and it devastated him. But instead of accepting the outcome or moving on, he began to stew in his own anger. He began to believe he was the real victim, that the world had turned against him, and the Dings were to blame for all his failures. That's what makes this story so chilling. Not just the brutality of the crime, but the psychology behind it. Du didn't just wake up one day and snap. This was a slow, poisonous build-up, a mental narrative he crafted over years, telling himself that if he suffered, someone else had to pay. And when people get stuck in that mindset, when revenge starts to feel like justice, they lose their humanity. During the investigation, friends and neighbors of Du were stunned. Many of them said they never would have expected this from him. They described him as quiet and normal. That's the part that hits hardest, isn't it? Because it reminds us that evil doesn't always come with a warning sign. Sometimes it wears a friendly face, and the way he carried out the murders showed just how calculated he had become. He waited until the perfect moment, a national holiday, when police resources were stretched thin and neighbors were distracted. He brought his own weapon. He knew the Ding's schedule. He knew their home. It was strategic. He didn't just want to kill them, he wanted to erase them. And even after the murders, Du's actions were methodical. He changed clothes. He dumped evidence. He had a getaway plan. These weren't the moves of a man acting in a moment of passion. These were the steps of someone who had rehearsed this in his mind over and over again. But perhaps the most haunting in part of this story is the silence that followed. For 2 whole days, no one knew what had happened inside that home. Neighbors assumed the family had gone away for the weekend. It wasn't until worried relatives contacted police that the truth came to light. And by then, Du was already halfway across the continent. When police arrived, they found the family lying in pools of blood. The girls' school uniforms were still hanging on hooks. Books lay open. It was like time had frozen. And in a way, it had. Because for the Dings, life ended in that house. And for everyone who knew them, it never truly went back to normal. Their friends described them as generous and kind, always opening their home to others. Xing, the older daughter, was preparing to go to university. Alice, just 12, loved music and dreamed of becoming a pianist. These weren't just names in a headline. These were real people with real futures, all snuffed out in a single afternoon. What this case teaches us is that evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. It waits. It wears the face of someone we trust. And that's why stories like this matter. Not because they're sensational, but because they remind us to pay attention, to ask questions, to reach out when we see someone drowning in silence. We can't change what happened to the Ding family, but we can choose to remember them not just as victims, but as reminders of how fragile life can be and how vital it is to face our pain before it consumes us. So take this moment to reflect, not just on the horror of what happened, but on the importance of empathy, connection, and vigilance, because in the end, it's not just about the killer, it's about the lives that were lost, and the lessons we must carry forward from their tragedy.